The sun hung like a furnace over the horizon, draining the moisture from the air and the strength from their bones. Adam drove his spade into the hard, cracked earth, but the soil resisted, jagged and dry. He paused, his chest heaving, and wiped a thick layer of grit from his forehead. Beside him, Eve moved along the rows, pulling at the withered stalks that refused to yield a harvest. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the plains, carrying a cloud of stinging dust that forced them to shield their eyes. Adam stood, his joints popping, and looked toward the distant, shimmering gates of Eden. They were closed. He turned back to the furrow, gripped the handle of his tool, and drove it into the ground again. They walked until the light began to fail, leaving deep, uneven trenches in the dirt as the only evidence of their survival. Seasons bled into years, and the shadow of the parents grew long. Two figures emerged from that shadow, shaped by the land they claimed. Cain stayed tethered to the furrows. He spent his hours bent double, fingers buried deep in the dark, stubborn earth, pulling at roots that refused to yield. His skin grew rough, stained permanently by the soil he fought to tame. He watched the horizon with a heavy, steady gaze. Abel moved differently. He walked the high ridges, his eyes constantly scanning the movement of his flock. He learned the language of the hills, the shifts of the wind, and the rhythm of the grazing herds. One evening, the two brothers met at the boundary where the tilled earth met the wild grass. Cain stood with a heavy hoe in his grip, his boots caked in thick gray mud. Abel approached from the slope, a staff in his hand, his movements fluid and light. They stopped. No words passed between them. Cain turned back to his row, his jaw set tight, while Abel continued toward the rising moon. The divergence was complete, one bound to the dirt, the other to the wind. The morning air hung heavy and still, devoid of the usual sounds of the fields. Cain and Abel walked toward the center of the valley, where a flat, raised expanse of rock waited. They had chosen this place for its permanence. Cain arrived first, his arms laden with heavy stones. He dropped them with a dull thud, the impact vibrating through the ground. He knelt, his fingers working the rocks into a rough, circular pile. He paused, his hands hovering over the center, eyes fixed on the gray surface. The silence was absolute. Abel approached from the opposite direction, his pace measured and deliberate. He carried nothing but his staff, yet his gaze remained locked on the altar. He reached the stones and stood beside his brother. The structure stood waist high, a stark monument against the vast, empty horizon. Cain stepped back, wiping his palms against his legs. Abel moved forward, circling the altar once, his hand brushing the cool, rough edges of the stone. They stood on opposite sides, the altar between them. The sky above began to lighten, casting long shadows. Everything was prepared. The brothers stood motionless, waiting for the moment to offer. Abel turned his back to the altar and walked toward the edge of the slope where his flock rested. He moved through the herd with a gentle, searching gaze. He did not simply take the first creature he reached. He knelt beside a yearling, running his hands deep into the fleece to check for density and warmth. He stood, watched the flock move, and shook his head. He walked further, his eyes scanning the gait of each animal. He stopped before a lamb standing apart from the others. He circled it, observing the strength in its legs and the clarity of its eyes. This was the one. He reached out, his touch steady and soft as he guided the animal away from the rest. He did not rush. He checked the fleece one final time. He lifted the lamb, cradling its weight against his chest. The animal remained calm, sensing the lack of malice in his grip. Abel walked back toward the stone altar. He did not look at the horizon or the sky. His entire focus remained on the offering in his arms. He reached the stones and paused, his breath even. He placed the lamb upon the altar with a precision that bordered on prayer, his hands lingering for a heartbeat before he pulled them away. He stepped back, his head bowed. Cain watched the ritual with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. He did not move toward his own pile of harvested goods until the silence had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. He walked to the edge of the field, his boots dragging through the dry, cracked earth. He grabbed a handful of stalks, the ends brittle and yellowed, and scooped up a cluster of fruit that had already begun to soften and bruise in the heat. He did not check the quality, he did not arrange them. He walked back to the altar, his stride heavy and impatient. He reached the stones and tossed the bundle onto the flat surface. The stalks landed in a tangled heap, and the fruit rolled, one piece thumping against the stone and splitting open. He did not look at the offering. He did not pause to adjust the pile or offer a gesture of respect. Before the dust from his movement had even settled, he turned his back to the altar. He walked away, his pace quick and jagged, heading toward the shade of the distant trees. He did not look back at his brother, nor did he look at the altar. His shoulders remained hunched, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides, his focus entirely on the path ahead, leaving the altar behind as if it were nothing more than a chore completed and forgotten. The silence over the altar deepened, heavy and expectant. Then, the air itself began to change. A subtle, dry heat radiated from the stones where Abel had placed his gift. It was not the heat of the sun, but something concentrated and deliberate. A faint, golden shimmer rippled through the air above the lamp, and suddenly a focused warmth descended. The stalks and the animal began to glow, the light intensifying, until it seemed to pull the very breath from the surrounding space. Abel remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the stones as the offering was enveloped by a silent, invisible fire. The scent of sweet, charred earth rose into the sky, signaling a profound and immediate recognition. But just inches away, the atmosphere remained stagnant. The air around the fruit and stalks Cain had discarded stayed thin and biting. No warmth touched the bruised produce. No light flickered over the tangled heap. The warmth did not spread. It stopped abruptly at the boundary between the two offerings. The divide was clear, etched into the very air. Cain stood frozen, his eyes locked on the pile of fruit and stalks. The silence of the altar felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He watched the light fade from Abel's side, but his gaze remained fixed on his own offering. It sat exactly as he had left it, cold, lifeless, and ignored. A tremor started in his jaw, the muscles bunching and tightening until his teeth ground together with a sharp, audible click. He did not blink. His hands, calloused and stained from the soil, hung at his sides. Slowly, his fingers began to curl inward. He squeezed until his knuckles turned stark white, the skin stretching thin over bone. His breath hitched, catching in his throat like a jagged stone. He stared at the altar, waiting for a sign, a flicker, anything to acknowledge his labor, but the air remained stagnant. The sting of the rejection burned deeper than any physical wound. He felt the heat rise in his neck, a sharp, pulsing pressure that made his vision blur at the edges. He stood motionless, a statue of suppressed rage, his entire frame vibrating with the effort to contain the fury that was beginning to boil beneath his skin. The tension finally snapped. Cain jerked his head away from the altar, the movement sharp and violent. He did not look at Abel. He did not look at the stones. He simply pivoted on his heel, his heavy boots biting into the dry, packed earth. Each step was a deliberate strike against the ground. He marched away from the site of his humiliation, his pace rapid and uneven. Behind him, the dust rose in a thick, choking cloud, hanging in the stagnant air like a curtain between the two brothers. He walked with his head down, his shoulders hunched, his arms swinging with a rigid, mechanical rhythm. The distance between him and the altar grew with every stride, yet the space felt charged with a new, dangerous energy. He did not slow down even as the terrain turned rougher, his path cutting a straight, jagged line toward the distant, shimmering horizon. The sound of his heavy footfalls echoed across the field, his focus narrowing until there was nothing left but the burning, silent fury. Cain kept walking, his boots kicking up small stones that skittered across the parched ground. He was miles from the altar, his lungs burning with the exertion of his flight. Suddenly, the wind died. The ambient hum of the insects ceased, leaving a vacuum of sound so absolute that the ringing in his ears became deafening. Then, the air itself seemed to vibrate. A voice, deep and resonant, rolled across the empty expanse, carrying the weight of a mountain. "Cain, why is your face downcast?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled, his momentum faltering. The voice continued, unyielding and sharp. "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" Cain froze. The air grew heavy, thick, with a sudden, suffocating pressure. "Sin is crouching at your door," the voice boomed. Cain stood motionless, the warning hanging in the air, transforming the silence into a trap. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was heavy with the echo of the command he had just received. Cain remained rooted to the spot, his spine rigid, his head bowed against the vast open sky. He did not look up. He did not seek the source of the voice. Instead, his jaw muscles bunched, pulsing with the force of his clenched teeth. A low, ragged breath escaped him, sounding more like a snarl than a sigh. He refused to acknowledge the truth of the words. He refused to repent. Slowly, with deliberate, jagged movements, he turned his back on the path he had traveled. His eyes, dark and narrowed, swept over the edge of the forest where the sunlight failed to penetrate. He took a step, then another, his boots dragging through the dry grass. The trees loomed ahead, a wall of gnarled branches and deep, tangled shade. He reached the perimeter and did not hesitate. He pushed through the outer layer of brush and stepped into the gloom. The sun hung high, casting short, sharp shadows across the fields. Cain stepped out from the tree line, his eyes scanning the horizon until they locked onto a familiar figure. Abel was standing near the edge of the pasture, his attention fixed on the movement of his flock. He did not notice the change in his brother's posture, or the way Cain's hands remained balled into tight fists at his sides. Cain walked forward, his pace steady, his expression carefully smoothed into a mask of indifference. He stopped a few paces from Abel, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. "Come with me," Cain said, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth. Abel looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion, but he saw only his brother. He nodded, leaving the safety of the open field behind. They moved together toward the lower meadow, where the stalks of grain grew thick and tall. The vegetation rose around them, swaying in a light breeze, effectively cutting off the view of the distant homestead. Cain led the way, his stride purposeful, drawing Abel deeper into the dense, waist-high grass. The sounds of the farm faded, replaced by the dry rustle of stalks brushing against their legs. They were alone, far from the reach of any watchful eyes. The wind that had been rustling the stalks died away in a single sharp instant. The world fell into a vacuum of sound. Not a leaf stirred. not a bird called. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, pressing against their ears like water. Abel stopped, his brow furrowing as he turned to look at his brother, sensing the sudden shift in the air. Cain stood motionless, his chest heaving with shallow, jagged breaths. His eyes were fixed, burning with the heat of days spent in the shadow of his own resentment. Every muscle in his frame was coiled tight, vibrating with a kinetic energy that had nowhere to go. He did not speak. He did not warn. He simply let the bitterness take control. He lunged, his boots tore into the loose earth, propelling him forward with a violent, desperate force. The distance between them vanished in a heartbeat. Cain's hands reached out, fingers clawing at the air, his entire body weight committed to the strike. The dry stalks snapped and crushed under their feet as they collided. The mask of indifference shattered, replaced by the raw, unbridled momentum of his intent. The violence ended as abruptly as it had begun. A cloud of fine gray dust hung suspended in the stagnant air, slowly drifting down to coat the trampled stalks. The field returned to a state of unnatural stillness. Cain stood over the spot where the grass had been flattened, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven bursts. His hands, still trembling, hung uselessly at his sides. He looked down, but his eyes refused to focus on the shape in the dirt. The silence was no longer heavy with anticipation. It was hollow, echoing with the finality of what had just occurred. He took a half step backward, his heel catching on a root, and he stumbled. He did not try to regain his balance. He simply stood there, rooted to the earth, watching the dust settle into the creases of the soil. The heat of the day seemed to intensify, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. He wiped his palms against his legs, but the sensation of grit remained. He turned his head, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but the world remained empty. The reality of the act began to sink in, cold and sharp, settling deep into his marrow. He was entirely alone in the field, the silence stretching out toward the horizon, unbroken and absolute. Cain turned his back on the field and began to walk. His pace was erratic, his boots kicking up small plumes of dust that lingered in the stagnant heat. He did not look back. He focused on the horizon, his legs moving with a frantic rhythmic urgency as if distance could outrun the memory of the grass. Then, the air itself seemed to vibrate. A sound, deep and resonant, rolled across the empty land like thunder without a storm. It stopped him cold. Cain stood frozen, his heels dug into the dry earth, his breath hitching in his throat. The voice boomed again, demanding the location of his brother. Cain did not turn. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, his jaw locked tight against the sudden pressure of the moment. He reached up, wiped a bit of sweat from his temple, and spat into the dirt. The defiance rose in him, a cold shield against the weight of the question. He turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he spoke into the vast, empty space. "I do not know," he said, his voice flat and devoid of tremor. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The words hung in the stillness, sharp and biting, a final arrogant attempt to deny the truth. The arrogance of the question had barely left his lips when the earth beneath his feet lurched. It was not a tremor of wind or shifting sand, but a deep, rhythmic vibration that traveled up through his soles and into his very bones. Cain stumbled, his arms windmilling as the ground buckled. The voice returned, no longer a question, but a thunderous condemnation that seemed to tear the sky open. "What have you done?" The words were physical, a pressure that forced the air from his lungs. The ground beneath him groaned, a low grinding sound of stone against stone. Then came the revelation, cold and absolute. The blood of your brother cries out to me from the earth. Cain froze. The defiance that had armored his face only seconds before drained away, leaving behind a hollow, gray mask of realization. He looked down at his own hands, then at the soil, which now seemed to pulse with a dark, hidden life. The vibration intensified, shaking the very roots of the trees nearby. He tried to speak, to offer another excuse, but his throat had constricted into a tight, hard knot. The ground he had spent his life tilling was no longer a provider. It had become a witness. The strength left his legs as if they had been severed at the knees. Cain crashed down, his palms slamming into the dry, cracked surface of the field. His hands shook violently, the tremor traveling from his fingertips up to his shoulders. He tried to grip the dirt, to pull himself up, but the earth felt alien beneath his touch. It was hard, resistant, and cold. Where he had once coaxed life from these furrows, the ground now seemed to recoil from his presence. He clawed at the dust, his fingernails digging deep, but the soil did not yield. It packed tighter, turning into a solid, unyielding barrier. The silence of the field was absolute. A heavy shroud had pressed down on his back. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, but the dust he kicked up tasted like ash. He looked at his palms, stained with the same dark earth he had spent his life cultivating, and realized the connection was gone. The land was no longer his partner, it was his judge. He pressed his forehead against the grate, his body curled in a tight, desperate knot. Every muscle in his frame burned with the strain of his own weight. He was anchored to the ground he had betrayed, unable to move, unable to hide, and entirely alone in the vast, empty expanse of the world. The silence finally broke, not with a sound, but with a command that echoed through the marrow of his bones. Cain was to be a wanderer. He pushed himself upright, his muscles screaming in protest. His legs felt like lead, barely holding his weight as he swayed in the open field. He looked back toward the gates, but the path he had walked for years now looked like a foreign landscape. The sentence was absolute. He was stripped of his title, his purpose, and his place. There would be no more furrows to turn, no more harvests to anticipate. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sky met the jagged line of the wilderness. The air felt thinner, colder, and devoid of the familiarity. He took one step, then another, his boots dragging through the dust. Each movement was a severance. He was no longer a man of the earth. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of the world. The future stretched out before him, a vast, empty expanse. He walked forward, his head bowed, the crushing weight of a life without a home settling over his shoulders. He did not look back again. Cain stopped. A sudden sharp heat flared across his brow, stinging like a brand pressed into living flesh. He dropped to his knees, his hands flying to his forehead, fingers scraping against the skin. He clawed at the spot, trying to rub the sensation away, but the heat only intensified, sinking deep into the bone. It was not a wound that would bleed, it was a seal. He pulled his hands back, staring at his palms, then looked into the reflection of a stagnant pool nearby. A jagged, pulsing symbol burned against his skin, visible and undeniable. He touched it again, his breath hitching as he realized the truth. This was not just a punishment, it was a barrier. Anyone who saw him would know his crime, yet they would fear to strike him down. The shame turned cold, settling into his chest like a stone. He stood up, his movements stiff, the mark throbbing with every beat of his heart. He adjusted his stance, the weight of the mark pulling his head low, and stepped forward into the shadow of the unknown. The boundary of the known world vanished behind him. Cain moved into the brush, where the soil was hard, rocky, and unyielding. It did not respond to his touch. It resisted his every step. He stumbled over tangled roots and sharp stones, his breath coming in ragged, uneven bursts. The familiarity of the fields he had once tilled was gone, replaced by the chaotic, indifferent growth of the wild. He paused to steady himself against a jagged rock face, his fingers tracing the cold, rough surface. There was no path here, only the necessity of movement. He pushed away from the stone, his muscles aching with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. Every mile he covered was a bridge burned. He did not look back. The horizon beckoned with a vast, empty silence that swallowed his footsteps. He walked until the sun dipped low, casting long, distorted shadows across the pathless earth. He was a man untethered,